Hey there, it's Kari at Studio R12 Stencils, and today we're working with a super cool 3D sled for your winter decor. And we have a ton of techniques we're going to cover, from a wood grain background to painting with red to drop shadow, and I even have a little trick for the rails for you. Stay tuned. All right, let's get started. If you are tired of painting on circles and squares and rectangles, we totally get it. So today we wanted to give you a fun new surface that you can paint on, and it's 3D. So we have a ton of surfaces over on studior12.com, including this sled. It comes in 4 pieces. So we have the base of the sled, and it comes with holes already notched into it. And then it comes with the top part, also with the holes notched. Now, with this, we did take a drill to this so we could hang it and put the holes in it. And then you're also going to get your 2 rails. So we're going to put that together a little later. Okay, so now it's time to base coat our surface, and today we're going to make it look like a wood grain. We're going to use 3 different colors of stain, 2 browns and a black, and we are going to use a polyfoam brush. Now, all polyfoam brushes aren't made the same. At Studio R12, our polyfoam brush has a wood dowel that goes all the way up halfway into the foam brush, and then there's a piece of mylar. So when you are painting with your foam brush, just the tip of it is moving rather than the whole piece of the foam, which is what we've run into with some of the cheaper polyfoam brushes, foam brushes that we have picked up. So when we are starting with our base coat, we are going to go into a neutral brown that is just a nice normal color of wood, and we are going to base coat our board. We're going to pick up some stain, sweeping away from the edges. The edges of this board are already black, so if you put too much and you pull against it, or if you put too much and you go over the edge, then you are going to have to clean up your edges at the end. So we want to avoid that as much as possible and be gentle along the way. So to get the streaky effect with the different colors of stain, we want to make sure that our background, our base color, is dry before we start painting. Otherwise, we are going to get a muddy mess with all of the colors. So we're going to hit with a blow dryer. So when your project is still wet, it's going to be cool to the touch. So when it starts to feel not so cool, not sticky, that's how you know when your project is dry and ready to be painted on. So I'm gonna plop my polyfoam brush in the water. We just have a bucket of water that we keep our brushes in until we can get them cleaned after our project's done. And then I'm going to go into the darker color of brown. I'm just going to put the very top edge into it, kind of dab it off a little bit, offloading it, so I just have a little bit of paint on my brush. And then we're just going to start streaking it and sweeping it on our surface. So at first you're not going to see much. As you start adding more paint onto your brush, then you'll start noticing some more streaks as you go along. The very tip of the brush is going to give you some lines. You can start to see some faint fine lines coming. Now when you get to the edge, you're going to notice there's some lines across your surface. We just want to feather those out a little bit so that they're not super noticeable as endpoints of where we picked up or put down our brush. So there's not much rhyme or reason to where we're going, but you can see over here that I really didn't dab this off enough. So now there is a big brown blob on my surface. Don't worry, we are going to be able to use a handy dandy paper towel. I'm gonna put a little bit of a paper towel in the water, in our water bucket. And water is your best eraser when you are painting. So we got this a little damp, and we are just going to kind of wipe it away, and you can see the difference in the paint coming off and it just now kind of looks streaky. So that's one way to help get it faded if you're not happy with how streaky it is. The same thing happened with this board. We have some big streaks here and here, so we just took the paper towel to it and faded it away a little bit, and then it turned out looking really nice and rustic and streaky. So you do need to let this dry after you have put your water on there. If you start adding paint while it's wet, then you will start to get your muddy surface. All right, so now we have our brown, nice and streaky. We're going to add a little bit of black to this as well, just to give it a little more texture and a little more grain. I'm going to dirty brush this using my brush that I already used with the brown and start to put just a little bit of the black in it. You're just going to use really light strokes when you're doing this so that you can get the streaky look, not applying much pressure, sweeping away at the ends and the edges. All right, so now we have our light brown, we have our darker brown streaks, we have our black streaks. We're going to dry it real quick, and then we're going to work on a little bit of sanding. So now that that's dry, I'm going to grab a couple different sandpapers. We use a sanding block, and we have two different grits of sandpaper we use. The higher grit sandpaper is a finer sand, so we'll use these at the end of our projects when we just want to kind of give it a nice finishing touch. But when we're looking to do something rustic and gritty, like a wood grain background, then we're going to use our lower grit sandpaper that's a little bit more rough. So with our sanding block, we're going to go in and we are going to apply pressure and scrape it back and forth. We just wipe off the dust off the particles as they come along with it. We're going to do this in the same way that we painted our surface. So we painted it vertically, so we're going to do our sanding in the same direction. If you would like to get the edges a little more rustic, you can kind of put it on the edge here and spend a little more time focusing on that. Maybe this is a little too dark for what you wanted, and you can back it off just like we did with the paper towel and use your sanding block as one of your painting tools to help blend. There are also a couple more things that you can do to make this look like it's faux wood planked. You can use a T-square, you can use tape, and you can set it down, and you can use your polyfoam brush or a round brush, put it into your paint and make little lines and move it across your surface if you would like to make it look like it is faux planked as well, just to add a little bit more texture to your background. I think this turned out pretty awesome with all of our tools. So while we love the stencil that we are using on today's project, we wanted to add a little bit extra and put some snowflakes in the background. It's super easy, super quick, and it really adds a pop to your project. So we have our snowflake stencil, which you can see that I've already used this once. The beauty of our Studio R12 stencils is that they are reusable. You can use them over and over again. We have a video on how to clean your stencils that we will tag for you guys, so you can check out how to do that, do it properly so that your stencils will last you a very long time and you can continue to use them. So we are going to use our dome brush. A dome brush is a key to stenciling. I'll also tag a video on that. A lot of people paint with stencil with flat brushes that are straight across, and they do a patting motion. That can increase your chances of bleeding under. Bleeding under is one of the main things that people ask us about here at Studio R12. So we use what's called a dome brush instead. The entire brush is domed so that when you are stenciling, only the tip of the brush actually comes onto your project, even when you are doing your stippling and patting motion. I'm gonna grab a piece of tape and tape down our stencil just in a couple of different spots. Let's see. And this does not have to be perfect. We're just looking for a really dusty snowflake on our background. So I'm just going to tape it down here in a couple of different places. Our stencil is over the edge of our project, which you will run into often if you are stenciling. So when we get to those areas, we'll just make sure that we hold it down in that particular area so that it doesn't move. Where we taped our stencil, if we try to wiggle it, it's not going anywhere. So we're gonna get into our white paint. We use acrylic paint. I'm gonna put some on the brush, and then we are going to offload our paint. This is a key to stenciling and not bleeding under. We're gonna do about 15 swirls on our paper towel and then come over to our project, and I'm just applying a really little bit of light pressure. I do not want my snowflakes to be really bright. I want them to just be a little dusty so that you can see them in the background, but they aren't the focal point of our project. You may notice that we're doing a swirl motion instead of a tapping, stippling motion on our project. That's another trick into not bleeding under. Since we are getting so much paint off of our brush, we can swirl the paint along, and since it is a really dusty layer, this is actually what it's going to look like when you do your stenciling. Each layer is going to be dusty, and then they are going to just add on top of one another, and then they'll start to darken as you go. All right, so let's peel this off, and look how pretty and light that is. It just adds a little bit of texture. So then what we'll do is we'll just move this down, and this time I'm just gonna hold it since we're at the bottom. Just gonna add a little bit more here, so that we have our snowflakes all across our surface. And you can use these snowflakes in so many ways. There's some small ones, there's some large ones. You can use them on cards, you can use them on surfaces. So look how pretty that turned out with just a little bit of snowflakes. That's pretty just as it is, even without even stenciling over top of it. Now we're going to go into our main stencil design. We chose this sled ride stencil because we wanted to give you something that you could put up after Thanksgiving and leave up all throughout the winter. So if you wanted to not have to worry about taking something down after Christmas, sled rides, you can put it up after Thanksgiving, leave it up until winter is over. So with our stencil, our stencil fits right inside our surface, which is awesome, so that you can just lay it right down there. You know exactly where it goes. Now you can also do this a little offset. You could turn it a little bit to make it look like the sled riders are going downhill. And you can also use our T-square to check and make sure that your stencil is right in the middle of your surface. So this surface is 9 inches across. I know that the little banding here at the top needs to be around 4.5 inches. I'm going to turn it just a little bit until it's in the right spot. And there we go. Our little painting roller comes in handy for that. So now we're going to tape down our stencil. And this one we're going to tape down a little bit more so that we can make sure it does not go anywhere. We do not want it to move while we are stenciling. There are a bunch of little places here. So if your stencil moves a smidge, then you could find yourself in trouble with trying to clean that up. But don't worry, we'll show you how to do that. So we're not going to stencil this whole project for you today. I'm just going to show you a couple different parts. We are going to do the red, so I can show you how to do the red, and then we are also going to do the drop shadow. Now you can see that when we did this, we added in some blue just to give it a pop of color. We added a little blue here, we added a blue behind the sledders, and then if you look really close, you can see that there is blue on top of all of our snowflakes, just to really bring that color around through the whole project. So we're going to start with painting with red. We actually have a Facebook Live Q&A, which we will tag below, and we had answered tons of questions on how to paint with red. So you'll want to make sure you check that out, and be sure to follow us over on Facebook. We go live every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, and Patty and I do a Q&A. We answer your questions. We show you different tips and tricks and techniques. And then we also upload those videos here on YouTube in the Facebook Live Q&A playlist so that you can catch them and watch them over and over and over, because there are so many great techniques that you're going to want to catch. So when it comes to painting with red, I'm going to show you a couple different things. We are going to show you what it looks like if we just paint red on this surface, and then I'm going to show you the correct way to do it. When you're working on a dark surface and you're trying to also use a color that is a little darker that might not show up as well, if you do not put a base coat under it, you are not going to be able to see it. So I'm going to do this first letter to the right with just a couple layers of red paint. And once again, I put paint on my brush and came over to my paper towel, and I'm doing just a swirling motion, swirling my paint on. Now, there are a lot of areas in this stencil that are really tight together, so you have a couple options for that. We actually have a Studio R12 multi-masker. This was something that we made so that we didn't have to tape all the time. With this multi-masker, we can stick it down over top of the area where we might ghost into and get our red paint into where we don't want it to be, and then it gets on the multi-masker rather than on our surface. And these are reusable. You can wash them just like you wash your stencils. They're just made out of Mylar, and there are several different shapes on them. So if I would want to cover up this boot, there's a small area to do that. There's also squares and dots. These are great for gnome beards. Really awesome tool. Okay, so now I have this one in red. I'm gonna let that dry, and then I'm going to show you how we actually paint with red. We are going to grab some gray. We don't recommend doing white. If you do white as your base coat, sometimes it can look pink because the red on top of the white sometimes doesn't mesh very well. So what we do is we choose a gray color, a light gray, and we'll just put a little bit out, and we are going to base coat our other sled rider with gray, and then put the paint over the red paint over top of it. So I'm going to pop my white into the bucket. With our dome brushes, we keep them in the bucket until we're ready to wash them, and then we have a brush cleaning video for you as well that you guys can check out to see how to clean your brushes. So I'm going to get my gray on my brush, and I'm going to swirl it off quite a bit because I do not want a really heavy layer of gray on this project. I just want a little bit just to give me a little coating. Okay, so now you can see that one of our sled riders is red, and one of our sled riders has a really nice little dusting of gray. I'm gonna hit that with the blow dryer real quick so you can see the difference in when we paint red over top of the gray compared to red by itself. So now with this red, since we have our layer of gray on here, I am going to do a stippling motion, which is a tapping motion. Stippling does cover more ground quicker. I get a little impatient sometimes when I'm stenciling, so I do like to stipple. And it also, I like the coverage that stippling gives, especially with reds. And even though we're stippling, we are still offloading our brush onto our paper towel. You especially want to do that when you stipple because you have more paint on your brush, and where you are stippling, the paint goes deeper up into the brush, so then you can increase your chances of bleeding under. All right, so now we are going to peek and take a look at this so I can show you the difference in what it looks like with the red versus what it looks like with the undercoat. So look how different this looks. The just plain red is just kind of there and it kind of fades into the background. But when we did our gray first and then we painted the red over top, you can actually make out the details of the sled rider and it pops off the project. Okay, now we are going to talk about drop shadow. Drop shadow is a really fun technique that can just add a little layer and pop to your words. We have several videos on drop shadow for you guys to check out. So now we're going to place our stencil back on here. You don't have to line it up perfectly. Right. There's a couple different ways you can do this. You can do we could do a base coat with black, showing where our letters go, which we'll do that, and then we'll show you another way to do it as well. So black is our main color here. So what we're going to start with is base coating with black just on a couple of the letters so that we can see when we move the stencil where our letters should be when we go back to finish them. So now we've painted our sled. You can see it's just a little dusty layer. So then when you are doing your drop shadow, and this is personal preference, you can either go to the right, to the left, you can go up or down, but you do want to do it the same throughout your entire project. So I like to go down just a smidge and then to the right. So you'll be able to see on your stencil and on your surface, the part that is brown is the part that is going to be white, and then we'll paint over the black as well. Now, since we already have something painted on our stencil, since we have the sled riders already done, you wouldn't have had to do the word sled. You could have just gone in here, gone to your sled riders, and I wanna go down a little bit and to the right a little bit, and we could have used our sled riders as our guideline for doing our drop shadow. So you may have noticed that we have used several brushes for this project. So if you are interested in stenciling, one thing that you want to think about while you're stenciling is how many brushes you have. If you have just a couple of brushes, you want to make sure that you take care of all of one color with that brush before you put it into the water, because once you put it into the water, you will have to wash it out and you are going to have to let it dry, which can take up to a day before you get into your stenciling again. Because if your brush is wet and you put it in the acrylic paint and you try to paint with it, then it's going to have a little bit of water in there. It can thin down to the paint and it can increase your chances of bleeding under. I'm actually gonna grab a different brush here. We're gonna go to our white, we're gonna swirl off, and I'm going to stipple here for more coverage quicker. Okay, so now we have our white done on the word sled. I'm gonna pop the white into the bucket, but I am going to come with my blow dryer to make sure that the word sled is really dry before I move my stencil. Because if the paint is still wet and you try to scoot your stencil, move your stencil, you can also scoot the paint and then you'd have some major cleanup to do. Now that that is dry, we can pull this back and you can actually see there's a little bit of a drop shadow already there. So if our goal was to do a black drop shadow underneath the white, then we would be good to go. But guys, take a look at this. I wasn't being careful and I accidentally ghosted onto the little frame part of my stencil, but don't worry, we can fix that. So water is your best eraser when it comes to fixing paint mistakes. We use this little PVC eraser. It works amazing. If I just go to my project and I start erasing, you can see that nothing happens. But if we put it in our water bucket and we get it wet, you can use it with the water to erase the paint that you just put on your project. And there, it's coming up. And you can also use a paper towel for this as well. But keep in mind, if you have just recently painted your background, then some of your background might come up with it. Now, if there's still some there and you're not happy with it, then you can go back a step. We could grab one of our polyfoam brushes. We could go into our stain, and then we could just go back and start sweeping on the stain so that we can just cover up, go back one step, and fix our mistake. Okay, so now we're going to go back into our sled and we are going to line it up with the black portion that we had painted originally. We're going to go back into our black paint, and then we are going to stipple for coverage to get our drop shadow. Now this is probably going to take a couple layers. We often get asked, how many layers of paint do I need? And that is just going to be determined by what you want your project to look like. So with the snowflakes that we did, we just wanted them dusty, so we did one layer. I don't even know if you can consider it a layer. It was like a half layer. But for some of the other portions of the project, with the sled riders and with the words, we wanted them to really pop. So we would do multiple layers. I think I did 3 layers of black over top of the white to really make this pop. Okay, so let's peel this back, and there you can see your drop shadow on the sled. Isn't that cool? It's a super easy way to do it through your stencil. You don't have to do it with a round brush and paint it by hand. Just use your stencil, move it a little bit, easy peasy. Okay, so now we are ready for the fun part. Let's make this sled 3D. So with these 3D cutouts, I want to show you some of the easiest ways that you can paint them. When I first started painting with the cutouts, I started using a foam brush, and I would just go into my paint and I would sweep it across. But there are so many nooks and crannies that you end up pulling the paint, it smushes the brush, and it gets paint in all of the edges. So you can do that, but then you have to go in with a teeny tiny brush, get into your black, and start to get into the edges to paint over what you boo-booed. So we do have a way to prevent that, and it is our little dauber. So this is super cool. It is a foam brush on top of a little finger thing. And so what we'll do is we're going to go into, let's go with red so you can see what it would look like on the back of this. And so then what you're going to do is you're going to load your dauber. You're going to offload it just like we do with our brush, and then you are just going to tap it in a stippling motion. Now you don't have to offload it as much because you can smush it around quite a bit to get it where it needs to go. But look how easy that goes on. And then we don't get any issues with our edges because we are able to determine exactly where that dauber goes. So that is a super fun way an easy way to paint your 3D portions, the portions that you're gonna have your cutouts of. Now with the dauber, you will want to immediately put it into your water. So you wanna get it nestled in so that the whole portion of the sponge is in the water. Otherwise it will dry and it will get crusty and it will not last you very long. So that's how to do that, super easy. Same way with the sled rails. you can do your dauber to paint that, but we also wanted to show you something fun to add a little amazing touch to your sled. How cool is this? We're going to show you how to make 3D and then how to actually make that 3D pop even more. So to add a raised texture onto your project, we are going to use a modeling paste and we are going to use a palette knife. And this is going to be very similar to baking a cake, icing a cake. You'll get into, put your modeling paste on your palette paper or on your paper plate. We like palette paper for this because when you are on a paper plate, you sometimes come up onto the edges and then it'll get stuck in the little grooves, or you might have a hard time scraping it and getting off. So we like a flat surface for our modeling paste. Then you're just going to kind of work it around a little bit, just like you would with cake icing. We're going to get it off here. You can see I got a little bit of red in there. So we grabbed this stencil. Has a little bit of wisp, has a little bit of snowflakes. We just put the wisps where we wanted them and then moved it along. So let me show you how to do it on this surface. You do want to make sure that you tape it down really well because you do not want your stencil to move while you are doing modeling paste, because the modeling paste, if it moves, it's going to cause you a mess. Modeling paste dries very quickly. We are going to just scrape up a little bit on the edge of our brush, on the edge of our knife, and then we are going to lay it over top of our stencil just like icing. This takes a little bit of practice. We recommend starting with a practice piece of wood or even a piece of cardboard that you can test this on, maybe the back of a project that no one will see, so that you can kind of get the feel for this. You'll realize once you're doing it the amount of pressure that you need to add, how quickly you need to go, because what happens with the modeling paste is that it dries, and once it dries, it hardens, and that is what gives you your 3D texture. All right, so I think we're good to go here, just to show you guys how it works. So as soon as you're done with your modeling paste on your palette knife, you want to get your palette knife wet and you want to clean up your palette knife to get all of the modeling paste off of it so that it does not dry and harden on your palette knife. The same is going to go with your stencil. So when I was painting this one from side to side, I had to move my stencil 3 times. So as soon as I got done with one, I went and washed it off underwater, got all the modeling paste off, came back and moved it. Made sure it was really dry so that I didn't get my surface wet, and then moved it, and then went and washed, painted, went and washed, and moved it a 3rd time. So now we're going to peel this up. Go wash your stencil immediately so it doesn't get ruined. And then we have our little 3D surface here, which is super cool. It just adds something to your project. And we were really excited when we found the stencil to do this, because doesn't it look like you're going down on a sled and the little snow going around it? So when it comes to using your modeling paste, you do want to let this dry and harden. Overnight is best. Since we're not using a whole bunch of it, you could potentially wait a half day on this particular project, but we typically recommend letting it dry and harden overnight so that you can paint on it the next day. So now we want to show you how to paint on top of this. You can also add paint into your modeling paste and make that portion 3D, but we wanted to show you this fun technique. So we have some different colors of gray here, the same grays that we use throughout our project. And we are going to start with the dark gray. And we're actually going to, instead of using, I'm gonna get a new piece of palette paper here. Instead of using a dauber here, we are going to use a paintbrush and show you how you can do that on your 3D cutout pieces. Get our paint on our brush and then swirl off. And since we are working on the edges, we want to make sure that we also get swirled off so that we're not bleeding over. We don't want to have any little drippage. So now what I'm doing is I'm just kind of scumbling back and forth. It's kind of a swirling motion, and it's also kind of just like a coloring, if you will. And we are just covering up over top of our modeling paste and then over top of the surface. So when we did our practice piece of this, we only did one coat of the gray to base coat this rail. We recommend doing two because you can still see a little bit of the wood coming through. So I'll show you the difference between one coat and two. All right, so I can already tell a huge difference. This is the portion that had one coat. You can still see the brown coming through. And then this is the portion that has two coats, and it is nice and covered. So now that we have our gray on, we want to show you how to really make this 3D portion pop. So how we're going to do that is we are going to go into a lighter gray, something that's really, really light compared to what we had used. Just put a little bit out on our palette paper. We're going to grab another brush, and this is still a little wet. Let me hit it with the blow dryer. So I'm going to grab a smaller brush here, and I'm going to put it into my lighter paint, and I'm going to swirl off almost all the paint. This is what's called dry brushing. You hardly have any paint on your brush, and then we are going to just go over the portion of the sled rails that we put the modeling paste on. So now you are going to be able to see it some on the background, but we are using this to emphasize the 3D portion of the sled rails. And oh my gosh, I don't know if you can see it, but I can tell, and it looks so cool already. It looks like there's a little bit of a dusting of snow on it. It's amazing. I'm gonna go do a little bit more here on the edge. All right, are you ready for the big reveal? Check out the dusting we did with our dry brushing, just adding a little more pop to the areas that were already 3D. How cool does that look? So now that we have all of the portions of our project painted, let's talk about how to put it together. A couple pieces of our project already have the notches put in them, and they fit right on top of the rails. So the front portion is going to go on the front of the rail, and you'll know if you have your rail in the right place or not, facing the right way, because otherwise it's not going to fit in correctly. All right, so there's that, and it just slides right in. So one thing that we always do when we put these sleds together for the final time is we use some tacky glue. And with the tacky glue, we will do the sides that are going to go into the notches. And then this middle piece is just a brace piece. So there's not a middle piece cut out in the sled because we didn't want to take away from the majority of projects that we've done on these have had our design right in the middle. So we wouldn't be able to do a lot of the projects that we've done on our sleds if it had a hole in the middle. So the middle sled rail does not actually go into the project, it just helps stabilize it. So with that, we would put the glue right on top of that stabilizer, and then we would push this down on here and then let it dry. So then you can see that the sled rails just slide right into the notches, and then you have your 3D sled. And then we topped it off by just adding a piece of rope that we tied through here and then tied up on the top, and then you can hang it on your door and have a nice fun 3D project for the winter season. If you loved today's project and want to see more, be sure to subscribe to Studio R12 Stencils right here on YouTube and hit the bell so that you can be notified anytime we add new tips, tricks, and tutorials.